Hey everyone, it's Aiden from Bespoke Coachworks here, back for another video. This time we're going to be shaping a guard for the rear quarter of the Rolls Royce Phantom 3. So got a couple of neat little sort of tricks, explanations of showing how I use thumbnail shrinking dies, and a little tip in there that I don't see publicized very often, and it's something that I come across, and it saves a lot of work when it comes to shrinking. So look out for that one a little bit further up in the video. Also have the way that I like to select a English wheel anvil, and so yeah, really sort of helpful tip I think, and it explains my process and thinking of how I select that. So that's also later on in the video when I get up to the wheeling portion. So this part here will be all made in, the guard will be made in two pieces. So this is the first piece, and I'll cover the shrinking and the wheeling, so the completion of this front portion all in this video. So starting off with our paper pattern. Now it's important when you're doing a paper pattern like this, particularly on a compound curve, is to understand where all the work needs to happen and where there's going to be the least amount of work to happen. So you can see I've got all the magnets on the front face. On the front face is where very little shaping needs to occur. So that's where I put all the magnets down on the flatter surface, because you don't want to trick your paper pattern. So you want to make sure you've got your panel, your paper on the panel in the flattest area possible. So you just know where the starting point is. So now I'm starting to pull in the puckers, so that's where I'm going to be shrinking. So when we're shrinking, we're going to be shrinking through the panel all the way to the start of our highlight line. So that highlight line is basically, it shows the light of the radius, and we always mark the one that comes off the front of the flattest panel. So like I said, I've got the magnets and the paper laid flat on the front face, which is going to be the least amount of work. I'm going to shrink all the way through and into where that highlight line is. The shrinks basically pull to exactly where the radius will start. So you'll see soon I will mark out that highlight line. Also too, just going through and sort of trimming the panel up, making sure my paper pattern is the correct sort of shape of what I want the material to be. It's important to remember that I've seen a couple of different processes. In the way that I like to do it is the amount of paper I have is the amount of material that I will need. So that's why I outline all my shrinks and all that sort of information. So here you can see I'm marking out the highlight line, and then remember the highlight is the start of the radius, is the one that we pay the most attention to. It's the one that shows first. It shows the transition between the flat section into the radius section. So I try not to overcomplicate my highlight line, my paper pattern too much. I just try and have the essential information, and that is my first shrinks and my highlight line and the panel size. You can't really, when you shrink, every panel is going to be different. So the rear portion will be different again, and you'll see that in an upcoming video. But this part here is a fairly consistent panel. So we need to make sure that our shrink lines that we put in our puckers are as consistent as possible, because if they don't start off consistent, it will trick you. So we're leading up to our first tip about shrinking dies, so here we go. Just wanted to show you something before I got started here. You can see on my pattern, I have my shrink lines coming up to this line here. This line here is the highlight line. I had a question the other day what a highlight line is. A highlight line is basically how a car shows its radius and different sort of shapes. So this is the sort of flat section of the guard, and this is the radius section. So the base of the highlight line is at the base of the radius. There's typically sort of 3 highlight lines on a radius. It will sort of be the start of it, the center of it, and the back of it. I'll always mark, as I'm shrinking through, I always mark the bottom one. You'll see here I've got this gap here before my highlight line. I'm not shrinking all the way to the edge of it. The reason for that is, you can see here on the thumbnail die, there's this section here, this between the bottom of the thumb and the edge of the die. So this space here that I have, this distance, is what that measurement is. It works out on these particular dies to be about 19 to 20 mil. So why that is when you're shrinking, if you were to shrink all the way to your highlight, that distance there, it leaves a mark further. So then when you smooth it out, your highlight line will push from here to here. So I shrink in, stop closer, close to my highlight line here, the distance, the 20 mil distance, and then once I smooth all that out, the highlight line will shift. So I hope that was helpful for anyone that has ever used thumbnail shrinking dies before, to get a little bit of an understanding on why sometimes they have that sort of bobble point at the end of their shrinking dies. That is why. So here, something to take note. These are nylon dies, and you can see here I'm sort of looking at it and I'm not really understanding what's happening. So this is the first time I had used these nylon dies on this particular machine. Usually I use it on my other reciprocating type machine. And what it's doing, because this is this power hammer has a free floating head, it was not hammering the shrink down because I think the nylon was bouncing the head too much. So whenever it had any sort of load, it was throwing the head back up and it wasn't giving it the sort of squish and really capturing that shrink. So I've changed over to my all metal dies, and it's working a lot better. It's doing exactly what a shrinking die is supposed to. So in the future, if I ever have to use the nylon dies, I'll be using them in my reciprocating only machine. So running through with the shrinking dies, obviously this is in a faster speed, but it's always important to go out slower than you come in. This is actually quite a technical panel to shrink up, just purely because of the size of it, and that it is aluminium. Aluminium is a more rigid material. It doesn't have the elasticity that steel has. So to develop that radius over, I do have to do a little bit more adjustment with a mallet into the sandbag just to help develop that radius around than what I typically would do if this was a steel panel. But it all still works the same. It just doesn't have that real sort of, like, it doesn't kick as hard as what it typically would. So you can see here just adjusting that edge, and all I'm doing really is just basically helping the form of the panel. I'm holding the panel with a little bit of pressure against the sandbag and using the hammer to help develop that radius around. So I'm not really doing a whole lot of elastic stretching. It's more just setting things in place. You can see I'm looking at that highlight, making sure that it's all developing in the right area. That's one of the most important points, is to understand and to really keep track of how that highlight line develops. If it was to be too low, the highlight line was too low, and as the panel develops and it stays too low, if you don't have enough excess on your material, you will end up shorting yourself. So something to always think about, that if you put a highlight line in an area and that's where you propose it to be, is that's where you make sure you put it. The way that I like to do it with my paper patterns is have them as accurately cut to my blank as possible, so you're able to get your paper pattern, put it back over the top of your panel. If you lose your highlight line or some detail features, you can put them back onto the panel. You're using your paper pattern continuously to put those details back in. So you can see also too, I've pulled the panel out of form. I spoke briefly in the last video about shape and form, so if you want to go back and have a look at that. But essentially what I've done, I've pulled the form out of the material. So out of the panel, so it's not the shape of what it's going to be on the car. And then that is allowing me to get it into the tooling without having the harsher marks. So now I'm using my body to pull the panel back into form, and you can sort of see, you can really see how the highlight lines have developed. You can see how the radius is starting to develop now that it's been pulled back into form. You can see there's still a little area in the center there that looks like it needs to be shrunk more, but I'll do a quick test on the car just to double check that that is the case. So holding it on there, you can sort of see that it's pretty good down the center, like down the bottom there. It's touching the panel. In the middle, it is not. Coming back to the power hammer now, pull the panel back out of form to allow the machine to get into the panel properly without creating any of the sort of harsh ridges. On power hammer work in particular, and on the English wheel, it is very quite handy to be able to pull the material out of form. You can pull a panel out of form easier if it is a compound curve. A reverse curve, a lot more difficult. The reverses tend to lock a panel into place. So that's why if you were to have a panel that has compound and reverse, typically you'll do the compound curve first, get that all smoothed out, and then pull in the reverse, because once you pull in that reverse, you will not be able to wheel it out properly, and also too, it's going to be harder to pull it out of form. So you can always see it, pulling it over the knee, things like that, just trying to manipulate it to get it into the machine as easy as possible. You remember that when you're bending it, so putting in a slip roller, bending it over your knee, things like that, you aren't manipulating the shape. So you're not adding or subtracting material. All you're doing is just changing the orientation of the material. So you do that to be able to get it into the tools, minimize tooling marks, all that sort of thing. A couple of little shrinks on the end. I usually leave the ends till last. The ends are always a little bit tough because in the center, you have material either side of it, holding on to the material. So if you're shrinking the middle of a panel, you've got material either side. The ends, there's only something holding it on one side. So I leave the ends till last, and then adjust them as necessary after the panel's done its thing. So last sort of few shrinks before we go on and do a little bit more of adjusting of the radius. A point to understand is when it's best to move on to the English wheel or change to radius dies on the power hammer to smooth it out. For me, you want to be able to have it as close as possible. You want to have the smoother you can get your panel going into before you go into the wheel, the better. It's the more bumps you have, the more work it is to try and wheel it out. You want to have the radius, fitting a radius gauge as best as you possibly can. I didn't actually check the radius gauge on it. For this instance, it is a custom body essentially, and then the first side of this car, it's all sort of about the feel and the overall look of it. When it comes to doing the other side of the car, I'll have to obviously replicate it, but I'll have a buck to go by. On this side of the car, it's about what looks best, what looks best by the eye, what feels the best. So I don't go too crazy about measuring radiuses and things. I will, briefly check it to make sure there's no variation over the panel too much. But in terms of I'm just really just chasing the aesthetic at the moment. So fitting on the car, you can see here, it's fitting it quite nicely, and we're getting on to my next tip about choosing the right anvil.
Just wanted to do a quick video before I start to wheel this panel on choosing your correct English wheel lower anvil. Okay, so you got your top that's flat. Now the way that I like to look at it is, if you have say you have the panel, I've got my radius gauge here, down here you can see it's quite close to a 3-inch radius, okay? And it's going to taper as it gets higher towards the top to a 4. All right, now if I was to put a 4-inch radius in this panel, think about what a 3 or a 4-inch radius is going to do to that. you know, you're looking at that gap, and that's just going to want to send my panel further around that radius. So when I choose an anvil, I always work to my long radius. And but when I say long radius, I mean this one. This would be my short radius, this would be my long radius. So it's choosing the right one. You're going to put it on there. You got a 36 there. It's got a little bit of a rock here and there. You can see the ends are a little bit raised. You put a 12, too much gap in between the center there. My bet is that it's a 24, and you can see that it's fairly consistent across the whole thing. So what we're going to do is going to work to a 24-inch radius, and we're going to work in facing this direction, not long ways on the panel. So we might, you know, we'll cross hatch both directions here. That helps blend the surface, and then we can come in the direction of the shrinks that we have here. Another thing when doing that as well is I always like to start with a cross hatch first. If you come in straight and you have your shrinks, you've come in straight with your shrinks, you're going to smooth those out, but they're still going to be quite wobbly. Where if you cross hatch these directions, you're blending you're blending the surfaces together, and it sort of smooths it out faster than if you were to follow the bumps. So yeah, just a quick tip that I like to use when choosing a English wheel anvil.
So I hope that helped a lot of you guys. It's something that I see often, that you have a 3-inch radius, so automatically people think that a 3 is the way to go. For me, the reason why you're not doing that is because you want to be able to have as much contact area on your panel at all times. That's what's going to give you the nicest surface finish, and it's basically just going to, it's keeping, like, you're smoothing. You know, in this process here, we've just done a whole bunch of shrinking. If we were to have a 3-inch radius in that lower, you think about the contact area of the wheel. If I was going long ways through that panel, you're only really contacting on maybe like, I don't know, maybe like a 5mm sort of contact area. It's going to be so minute, and that's just going to, you basically just going to be putting heaps of lines of like stretch, sort of tension into the material. So for me, lower pressure and a higher contact is the best way to smooth it out. You can see how quickly already that panel has started to smooth out. Typically, you run a cross hatch one direction, back the other direction, and then you go straight, and your panel it's already sort of 95% of the way there in terms of its smoothness, and then it's just about how good do you want to get it. So you can see still doing a little bit of cross hatching, and you can tell also too that I've pulled the material out of form. Another reason for that is that, like, if you look there, that's the best example. My hands aren't rolling with the shape of the panel. It's because the panel's been pulled out of form, it's sort of flattened out. So my wheeling is back and forth right in front of me. The more the panel takes the form, the more the panel would have to roll over the top of the radius and through. That becomes a lot more difficult to do, especially in these initial stages of the panel being a little bit bumpier because of the shrink, or even if you were to create all this panel with stretch only, hammering into the sandbag and walnutting that panel up, same deal. It's going to be a lot harder to wheel it out. So when you're wheeling like this as well, you're wheeling through, you can see that I haven't wheeled down onto the front face. I'll cover that shortly, because it is another important thing that I see people get wrong. But basically what I'm doing, I'm wheeling up to my highlight line slightly, same point every single time. If you're continually stopping in the same spot, if you think about it, you're kind of stretching that part twice as you do your passes, because you stop-start on the same spot, and you'll create a higher ridge. So essentially you've stretched it twice, so that's why it gets that high spot. So you can see how smooth the panels come up now. Just working it through. I've now back onto the power hammer, just to do a little bit of smoothing with the 36-inch radius, just on the very back side, as the panel starts to flatten out a little bit more and transitions into the next piece. So you can see here, just sort of working it along, sort of stretching out that edge a little bit. It was a little bit over shrunk, so it was just a touch like it was curling a little bit too much. So yeah, with the 36-inch radius in the bottom and the flat upper, I'm just sort of giving it a light hammer, just to smooth that out. That could be done on the English wheel, although I find that process easier, more controllable with the hammer, because with the hammer you can go in and stretch exactly where you need to. With a wheel, it's more of a it sort of irons the panel a little bit more, because you have to roll into it and you've got to roll that section. It's not as refined as into where you're hitting. So I prefer to do that part on the power hammer. But yes, it can be done in English wheel. I just have the luxury of having both, so that's the machine that I go to. I don't have a sort of set, English method or American method when it comes to my shaping. I just sort of use what's best for me, and that is using multiple tools in the way that I best see fit. This panel can be made completely on the English wheel, and with a mallet and sandbag, that panel could be completely made on the power hammer only. But I like to mix it up, use both. I love using the English wheel, particularly for my smoothing, because it gets that really nice glossy surface finish that the power hammer doesn't achieve as well, especially with aluminium. But it can be done on both, but purely just because of I love the meditative sort of state that the English wheel gives you. Like it's quiet. You have your headphones on and a good podcast or some music, and you just sort of just with the material, just doing your thing. So I really love that aspect of it. So that's why I don't do it all on the power hammer, but you certainly could. And some of these panels, you spend so much time on one machine, it's nice to mix it up and sort of diversify your skill set. Just briefly looking at the panel, you can see the highlights are looking really good. The panel's very quite consistent here. Just checking it with the radius gauge there, making sure nothing's happening. Inducing a little bit of form. And now that the panel it's getting very close, this is where I'm going to attack the front side. So a lot of the time when people do this, they'll pull their panel straight, and the front side, because you haven't done any wheeling or anything, is all wobbly. Initially I see people sort of freak out and think, oh no, my panel's all wobbly on the front side, I need to shrink it. It's actually not the case. What needs to happen is a little bit of stretch inbound from the edge. If you were to stretch the edge, then yes, you are going to have to go back in and do some shrinking, but it's actually the opposite to what most people think, and it's just because you have done so much work, shrinking, hammering, wheeling to the outer, that top radius, that the bottom part of the material is just sitting there like it come from the mill. It's had no work done to it. So yeah, that's just something that I see. I teach. This panel is actually something that I teach in classes, something very similar to this panel, and it's always the first thing that just freaks people out is that they think that it needs to be shrunk when it doesn't. Once again, that front of that face could have all been done on the English wheel, but it just needed a couple of little points that was just going to be easier to get into with the wheel. With the power hammer, to go in and just sort of hit it exactly where I needed it to. I do go back to the wheel just to finish it off, but like I said before, I like to just use the best part of the machinery, the best bit of machinery that I have available to me for the particular job. And for this point, so I could get real nice and close up to that highlight line and not sort of radius it around further, was the power hammer, because I could go in, just hit it exactly where I needed it to. Possibly I may have stretched the edge a little bit just a little bit on the roll-ins and etc. with the English wheel, so that's why I had to go in with the power hammer to hit it inbound. But yeah, so that's the reason why I just switched between the two machines. And yeah, I just think it's a good thing for people to understand. If you think about it, you've done all that work to the top. You've got your lower edges gone. Your front face has gone all wobbly. You haven't created extra material, so why would you need to shrink? That's really the crux of it. It's just really stopping and thinking, understanding. Okay, what's happened to my panel? What needs to be done? So it's just a little bit of English wheeling with a very low crown radius. I think I've got a 36 lower crown. And it's just very light pressure just to give it a little bit. So you can tell I just only slightly overstretched it. So I've just gone in and give it a couple of bump shrinks on the very edge, which ends up getting trimmed off anyway. As I go further through the panel to join my panels together, etc. That's where the wheel arch would be. But I just done a couple of little shrinks along there, and then there's just a couple of points that I just feeling the panel, I thought just needed a little bit more adjustment in the radius, and just adjusting that highlight line. So just very lightly raising those areas on the sandbag. Once again, you can do that all on the wheel. You could spend more time trying to blend that radius in with the wheel. I find it faster just to go in, hammer it exactly where you need to. It takes a couple of seconds, and then you go back onto the wheel, you smooth it out, and then you're ready to go again. So switching back out to the 24-inch radius after I get off my phone, the joys of running a business. Wheeling out just those small areas where I've had to hit it, and then the panel is just about done. So for anyone that's watching the videos, this full length, I'd really love to see some comments and give me as much feedback as you can. Is there something that you'd like to see a little bit more in terms of the way that the videos are, I guess, produced? I'm trying to do it so I can actually put it out, because I am running a business. I've got to make sure I'm as productive as possible, for my clients. And I find for me, this is the best way to do it. I can slow things down and show it if I need to, or I can just run it in fast pace, make my panel as usual, and then just voice over it for you guys and try and talk through what it is that I'm doing. If that's not working, please let me know, but I just want you to think about that. This is the best way for me to produce it, because I really want to be able to show this entire build for you. So just think about that. Let me know in the comments anything. So you can see here just a couple of little adjustments. The car, it's fitting very well to the car. Once again, didn't do a lot of trial fits, because you just get to know the panel and you understand where it needs work, how the shape is going. But yeah, you can see it's fitting quite well there. Another little tip that I like to do to clean up aluminium is I usually will give it a quick acetone just to get off some of the oil, and then I'll use Windex, and I find that Windex glass cleaner shines up the panel quite nice after you finish. So anyway, getting close to the end of the video now. Panel's fitting good. I hope I hadn't missed anything for you guys. I tried to explain as much as I could, and I was able to throw in a couple of things that I find are really quite key parts in shaping, especially shaping a compound kernel like this, and using thumbnail dies, selecting your English wheel anvil. I hope that all made sense. If any of it didn't and you want me to try and do some clarification, once again, let me know in the comments. I will try and help you out. And yeah, I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. This was a fun one. I enjoyed actually being able to have those tips in there and slow it down and actually speak to the camera. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. Just going over the panel there, you can see that it all fits really nicely into the other piece. All the radius is nice and tight. No sort of weird deflections or anything like that in the reflection or the highlights. You can see where that radius sort of bends around. That's what I'm talking about when it comes to highlight lines. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that video. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe. Let me know your feedback. Really appreciate it, and I'll catch you guys on the next video. Cheers.